The horrifying revelation of the Bell family photo that changed after restoration, 1875, Sarah Mitchell had always been drawn to forgotten things. As a photo restoration specialist in modern-day Nashville, Tennessee, she spent her days breathing life back into damaged photographs, watching faces emerge from water stains and tears like ghosts materializing from fog. Her small studio on the outskirts of downtown was cluttered with antique frames, chemical solutions, and scanning equipment that hummed softly in the background. The walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of restored images, each one a small victory over time and decay, each one a life reclaimed from oblivion. At 32, she had built a reputation for miracles, for finding details in photographs that others declared beyond saving. But nothing in her 15 years of experience could have prepared her for what she would discover in the Bell family photograph. Sarah's fascination with old photographs had started in childhood, when she discovered a box of family pictures in her grandmother's attic. The images were faded and water-damaged, but to young Sarah they represented something magical, windows into a world that no longer existed. She had spent hours studying the faces of ancestors she had never met, imagining their lives, their hopes, their fears. That childhood curiosity had evolved into a career, and then into something more, a calling. She believed that every person deserved to be remembered, that every face in every photograph represented a life that had meaning, value, worth. In a world that moved faster every year, that consumed and discarded with increasing speed, Sarah saw her work as a form of resistance. She preserved, she restored, she remembered. The package arrived on a cold November morning, delivered by a nervous courier who seemed eager to leave. It had been one of those mornings when the fog rolled in thick from the Cumberland River, wrapping the city in grey silence. Sarah had arrived at her studio early, as was her habit, brewing coffee in the small kitchenette and reviewing her schedule for the day. She had 3 projects in various stages of completion, all routine work. Portraits from the early 20th century that required careful cleaning and minor repairs. Nothing challenging, nothing that would keep her mind occupied in the way she craved. The knock on the door startled her. Deliveries usually came later in the day, and the courier who stood on her doorstep looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as she signed for the package. "Been sitting in our warehouse for a week," he said, his accent thick Tennessee drawl. "Nobody wanted to deliver it. Kept getting moved to the bottom of the pile. I finally said I'd take it just to get it out of there." He handed her the box and left quickly, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Sarah carried the package inside, noting its weight and age. The cardboard was soft with moisture and time, the tape yellowed and brittle. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, was a daguerreotype from 1875. The metal plate was badly tarnished, the image barely visible beneath layers of oxidation and age. She held it carefully, knowing that daguerreotypes were fragile, that the silver-mercury amalgam that formed the image could be damaged by the slightest mishandling. Even through the tarnish, she could feel something about this image, a weight that had nothing to do with the metal in her hands. A handwritten note accompanied it, written on heavy cream-colored paper that had itself seen better days. The ink was faded but still legible, the handwriting shaky but determined. "This belonged to my great-great-grandmother. The family legend says something changed in this photograph after it was taken. I need to know the truth before I sell the family estate. Payment enclosed. Please help." It was signed simply J. Carmichael, with a return address in Red Boiling Springs, Tennessee, a small town she had never heard of. The payment, Sarah discovered, was more than she usually charged, enough to cover weeks of work if necessary. Someone desperately wanted answers. Sarah held the daguerreotype up to the light, squinting at the ghostly shapes beneath the corrosion. She could make out 5 figures, stiff and formal, as was typical of Victorian-era photography. The exposure time for such photographs was long, sometimes several minutes, which meant the subjects had to remain perfectly still or appear as blurs. Something about this image felt different, though she couldn't articulate why. There was a heaviness to it, a weight that went beyond the metal plate in her hands. She had handled thousands of old photographs, had restored images from every decade of photography's history, but this one felt different. It felt like it was waiting for something, waiting for her. She cleared her main work table, pushing aside the routine projects she had planned for the day. This daguerreotype demanded her full attention, her complete focus. She set up her documentation station, preparing to photograph the plate in its current condition before beginning any treatment. This was standard procedure, essential for both professional responsibility and legal protection, but Sarah approached it with almost ritualistic care this time. She sensed, though she couldn't explain how, that this photograph would be important, that whatever she discovered within it would matter in ways that went beyond simple historical preservation. She began the restoration process that afternoon, working with the careful precision that had made her career. The studio lights hummed overhead, casting no shadows, providing the even illumination necessary for detailed work. Outside, the November afternoon darkened early, clouds rolling in to block what little sun remained. Sarah barely noticed, absorbed in her work, in the slow revelation of the image beneath the tarnish. First, she photographed the daguerreotype under various lighting conditions, documenting its current state from multiple angles: natural light, raking light, ultraviolet light, each revealing different aspects of the damage and the image beneath. Then she began the delicate chemical treatment, using specialized solutions to slowly remove the tarnish without damaging the silver-mercury amalgam beneath. The work was painstaking, requiring hours of concentration, but Sarah found the familiar ritual soothing. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, swabbing and rinsing, watching as the image gradually emerged from beneath its shroud of time and neglect. The process was almost meditative, allowing her mind to wander even as her hands worked with precision. She thought about the note from J. Carmichael, about the claim that something had changed in the photograph. That was impossible, of course. Photographs didn't change. They were fixed moments in time, permanent records of what had been. The chemistry was stable, the image permanent once properly developed. Whatever Carmichael's family legend claimed, it had to be explained by faded memory, by stories that changed in the telling, by the human tendency to see what we expected or feared to see, rather than what was actually there. By evening, she had made significant progress. The November dark had settled fully outside her windows, and the studio felt isolated, cut off from the world. Sarah had turned on every light, needing the brightness to see her work clearly, but also needing it for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. 5 figures stood before what appeared to be a substantial farmhouse, the kind that spoke of success and prosperity. 3 adults and 2 children, their faces severe with the solemnity required by long exposure times. The man in the center was tall and broad-shouldered, his beard trimmed in the fashion of the 1870s, his eyes cold and authoritative, even across the gulf of nearly 150 years. To his left stood a woman in a dark dress with a high collar, her hair pulled back severely, her expression blank in the way that suggested practiced concealment rather than genuine calm. To his right was another woman, younger, perhaps a sister or daughter, her hands folded at her waist in a gesture that looked more like self-protection than composure. 2 children stood in front, a boy and a girl, neither smiling, both with the pinched, wary expressions of children who had learned to be careful, to be small, to not draw attention. But it was the background that caught Sarah's attention and held it, that made her lean closer to the image despite the instinct to pull away. Behind the family, partially visible through a window of the farmhouse, was another face. It was indistinct, as if the person had moved during the exposure, creating a blur. Or perhaps it was simply a reflection, a trick of light on old glass. Sarah made a note to examine it more closely once the restoration was complete, though part of her already knew, in the way that we sometimes know things before we're ready to admit them, that it was neither movement nor reflection. It was something else, someone else. She worked late into the night, unable to stop, driven by a compulsion she didn't fully understand. The face in the window seemed to shift every time she looked away and back again, though she knew that was impossible. It was just fatigue, she told herself, just her eyes playing tricks in the dim light of her studio. But when she finally locked up and walked to her car, she felt an overwhelming urge to look over her shoulder, as if something had followed her from the image, as if the boundary between the photograph and the world had somehow become permeable. The drive home took her through quiet streets, past houses where families sat down to late dinners, where lights glowed warm against the dark. Sarah felt disconnected from all of it, as if she had stepped into a different timeline, one where the past wasn't safely contained in photographs, but could reach forward, could touch the present. She told herself she was being irrational, that restoration work sometimes affected her this way when she was tired, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the Bell family photograph was different. Something about it was wrong. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her studio to find the temperature noticeably colder than usual. Her breath misted in the air as she unlocked the door, despite the heating system running all night. She checked the thermostat, finding it set to the usual temperature, but the air remained frigid, as if something had drawn all the warmth from the space. The daguerreotype sat where she had left it, under the examination light on her main work table. In the clear light of day, she could see the image with perfect clarity now. The restoration was nearly complete, and what it revealed made her hands tremble as she reached for her coffee. She forced herself to eat breakfast, toast and jam that tasted like cardboard in her dry mouth before approaching the work table again. Professional distance, she told herself. Maintain professional distance. This is just another photograph, just another restoration project. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie. This was something else entirely. She spent the morning scanning the daguerreotype at high resolution, creating a digital file that would allow her to examine every detail without risking damage to the fragile original. The scanner hummed and clicked, its light bar moving slowly across the surface of the metal plate, capturing everything with merciless precision. As the image appeared on her computer screen, magnified to several times its original size, Sarah felt her stomach tighten with an inexplicable dread that went beyond anything she had experienced in her career. She had seen photographs of disasters, of wars, of deaths. She had restored images that showed suffering and pain, but this was different. This was intimate in a way that felt like violation, like she was witnessing something that should have remained hidden, that the subjects had believed would remain hidden. The face in the window was clearer now, and it was definitely not a reflection, definitely not an accident of exposure or light. It was a woman, her features gaunt and hollow, her skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. Her eyes were wide with what looked like terror or madness, or perhaps both, the whites visible all around the irises in a way that suggested she had seen things that had broken something fundamental inside her. Her mouth was open, as if screaming, though no sound could ever emerge from a photograph, frozen forever in that moment of anguish. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and Sarah could see, even through the distance and the glass of the window, that it was matted and dirty, the hair of someone who had not been properly cared for in a very long time. Sarah zoomed in further, her movements mechanical, professional training overriding the instinct to look away, to close the file, to pretend she had never seen any of this. The woman's clothing was different from what the other women wore, older in style, more tattered. The dress had once been fine. Sarah could see that in the remnants of lace at the collar and cuffs, but it was torn and stained, hanging loosely on a frame that had been starved nearly to the point of death. Around her neck was something that made Sarah's blood run cold, that made her lean back from the screen as if the image itself could harm her. It looked like a rope, or perhaps a chain, something dark and thick that bit into the pale skin of her throat. The woman's hands were pressed against the window glass, and Sarah could see now that her fingers were bloodied, the nails torn away completely, exposing the raw flesh beneath. She had been scratching at something, clawing at something, for so long that she had destroyed her own hands in the process. Fighting the urge to turn away, Sarah forced herself to examine the rest of the photograph with the same scrutiny. That's when she noticed the children. While the adults stared straight at the camera with the blank expressions common to long exposure photography, the children's eyes were turned slightly to the side, toward the window. And in their faces, Sarah saw something that Victorian stoicism couldn't quite hide: fear. She pulled out the note from J. Carmichael and reread it. The family legend says something changed in this photograph after it was taken. What did that mean? Photographs didn't change. They captured a single moment in time and preserved it. Yet as Sarah stared at the image on her screen, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at something that shouldn't exist. A moment that had somehow recorded more than what was visible to the naked eye in 1875. She spent the rest of the day researching the Bell family, driven by a need to understand what she had seen, to put context around the horror captured in that window. The surname was common enough, but combined with the location and date, she managed to narrow it down. The Bells had been a prominent family in Robertson County, Tennessee, owners of a large tobacco farm near Red Boiling Springs. The farm had been in the family since the 1830s, growing from a modest homestead to one of the largest operations in the county by the 1870s. The man in the photograph was likely Samuel Bell, a wealthy landowner known for his strict religious views and iron control over his household. Local newspaper archives described him as a pillar of the community, a deacon in the local Baptist church, a man who employed dozens of workers during harvest season. The two women would be his wife, Margaret, who came from a prominent Nashville family and had brought a substantial dowry to the marriage, and his sister, Catherine, who had never married and lived with the family as was common for unmarried women of that era. The children were his son, Thomas, age 8 in 1875, and daughter, Elizabeth, age 6. There were earlier children too, Sarah discovered, 3 infants who had died before their first birthdays, victims of the diseases that claimed so many children in that era. But Thomas and Elizabeth had survived, had been photographed, had been visible, unlike the woman in the window, but it was what she found next that made her hands shake as she scrolled through digitized newspaper archives, that made her understand that what she was looking at wasn't just a photograph, but evidence, testimony, proof of something that had been deliberately hidden. In the spring of 1876, less than a year after the photograph was taken, the entire Bell family disappeared. Not died, not moved away, disappeared. The farmhouse was found empty on a mild April morning by a neighbor who had come to borrow farm equipment. The table was set for dinner, food still on the plates, though it had gone cold and moldy by the time it was discovered. Margaret's sewing lay on the sofa, needle still threaded, as if she had just set it down for a moment. Samuel's pipe sat on the mantel, tobacco still packed in the bowl. Thomas's school books were stacked neatly by the door. Elizabeth's doll sat in a chair by the fireplace, its painted eyes staring at nothing, no signs of struggle, no notes, no indication of where they had gone or why. The neighbor had alerted the local sheriff, who conducted what passed for an investigation in rural Tennessee in 1876. He interviewed neighbors, examined the house and grounds, sent telegrams to relatives in other states. But no trace of the family was ever found. No sightings, no bodies, no explanations. The case remained unsolved, one of Tennessee's oldest missing persons mysteries, occasionally written about by local historians and true crime enthusiasts, but never resolved, never explained. The farmhouse had stood empty for nearly 50 years before being sold at auction, eventually finding its way into the Carmichael family. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she was learning. 5 people didn't just vanish into thin air. Not in 1876, not ever. Someone knew what happened. Someone always knew. Someone had to have seen something, heard something, suspected something. But the newspaper account suggested that the disappearance had been treated almost casually after the initial investigation, as if the community had simply accepted it, moved on, forgotten about the Bells as quickly as possible. There was something about that, about the ease with which they had been erased from memory, that felt wrong, that felt like deliberate forgetting rather than natural fade. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. 5 people didn't just vanish into thin air, not in 1876, not ever. Someone knew what happened. Someone always knew. She thought about the woman in the window, about the terror in her eyes, about the blood on her hands. Who was she, and why had she been photographed through a window, as if she couldn't or wouldn't come outside? As the sun set and shadows lengthened across her studio, Sarah made a decision. She would go to Red Boiling Springs, find J. Carmichael, and learn everything she could about the Bell family photograph. Something terrible had happened in that house, something that had been captured by the camera lens and preserved for nearly 150 years. And somehow she knew that understanding it was important, not just for historical curiosity, but for something deeper, something that touched on questions of freedom and captivity, of voices silenced and truths buried. She packed the restored daguerreotype carefully, wrapping it in acid-free tissue and placing it in a protective case, then printed several high-resolution copies of the digital scan, wanting backups, wanting evidence that could survive if something happened to the original. She locked her studio with more care than usual, checking the door twice, feeling irrational but unable to stop herself. The drive to Red Boiling Springs would take about an hour and a half, enough time to arrive before full dark, though the November sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her car as she pulled onto the highway. The landscape changed as she drove north and east, the urban sprawl of Nashville giving way to rolling hills and farmland. Subdivisions became scattered houses became isolated farms, the spaces between buildings growing larger with each mile. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a grey sky that promised rain or perhaps snow, the first of the season. Small towns appeared and disappeared, each one seeming more remote than the last, more isolated, more forgotten. Places where time moved differently, where the past wasn't safely contained in museums and history books, but still lived in the memory of houses and land and families who had occupied the same spaces for generations. Red Boiling Springs, when she finally reached it, was barely large enough to deserve the name. A handful of buildings clustered around a main street, most of them dark and shuttered against the coming winter. A sign welcomed visitors to historic Red Boiling Springs, home of the healing waters, referring to the mineral springs that had once made the town a resort destination in the early 20th century. But there was no evidence of tourists or healing now, just empty storefronts and houses that sagged under the weight of too many winters, too much neglect. The kind of town that younger generations fled from, seeking opportunity and excitement elsewhere. leaving the old and the stubborn to maintain what had been. Sarah drove slowly through the town, noting the closed gas station, the library that was only open 2 days a week, the elementary school that looked like it served maybe 30 children. She passed a church with a cemetery behind it, the headstones old and tilted, many of them so weathered that the names were illegible. This was a place where history wasn't something you studied, but something you lived with, where the dead were never far away, where the past and present existed in a kind of uneasy equilibrium. She found the address on J. Carmichael's note without difficulty, there being only a few streets to check. The house stood at the edge of town, isolated from its neighbours by overgrown hedges and a sense of purposeful separation. An old Victorian house that had seen better days, probably built in the 1920s given its style, though it looked much older due to neglect. The paint was peeling, revealing bare wood beneath, and several boards on the porch had rotted through and been replaced with newer wood that didn't match. Several windows on the upper floor were boarded up, dark squares that looked like missing teeth in a skull. But lights shone from inside the main floor, warm against the cold November evening, and smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the smell of burning oak. Someone lived here. Someone waited here. Sarah gathered her materials, the protective case with the daguerreotype, her laptop with the high-resolution scans, her research notes. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden porch, loud in the gathering silence of evening. She raised her hand to knock, but before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door opened, as if she had been watched, had been expected. A man in his 60s stood there, thin and stooped, with eyes that held a mixture of hope and dread. "Miss Mitchell?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." James Carmichael led her into a cluttered parlour that smelled of old books and wood smoke. Photographs covered every available surface, generations of faces staring out from frames of varying ages. "The Carmichael family has lived in this house since 1923, he explained, as he cleared a space for her on a worn sofa. "Before that, this house belonged to the Bells. This is the house from the photograph." Sarah felt her skin prickle with goosebumps. She was sitting in the same room where that photograph had been taken, in the house where 5 people had vanished without a trace. She looked around, trying to orient herself, to figure out which window had held that mysterious 6th figure. "Mr. Carmichael, your note mentioned a family legend. Can you tell me about it?" James settled into an armchair across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he poured tea from a pot that had been waiting. "My great-great-grandmother was Catherine Bell, Samuel's sister. She's the younger woman in the photograph. 3 days before the family disappeared, she managed to escape from this house. She ran to the neighbouring farm, hysterical, barely coherent. She told a story that no one believed at the time. She said Samuel had gone mad, that he had been keeping a woman prisoner in the attic for years, that he planned to do something terrible. The neighbours thought she was the one who had gone mad. Women's hysteria, they called it. They brought her back here, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive." Sarah's throat felt tight. "The woman in the window." James nodded slowly. "After the family vanished, Catherine's claims were investigated more seriously. They found evidence in the attic, signs that someone had been kept there. Chains bolted to the floor, scratch marks on the walls, dried blood. But they never found a body. They never found any of the bodies. The case was quietly closed. People didn't like to talk about it. It reflected badly on the town, on the Bell family's reputation. Over the years it became a local legend, a ghost story to scare children." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "But my family knows it was real. Catherine managed to send one letter before she disappeared to a cousin in Memphis. In it, she described what Samuel had done. The woman's name was Anna Whitmore. She had been an indentured servant, brought over from Ireland in the 1840s. Samuel bought her contract when she was 16 years old. He kept her as a servant for a few years, but then she tried to run away, tried to buy her freedom with money she had saved. Samuel couldn't allow that. It would have been an embarrassment, a challenge to his authority. So he locked her in the attic. For almost 30 years, he kept her there. His wife knew, his sister knew, even his children knew. But no one spoke of it. To speak of it would have been to acknowledge that it was wrong. And in 1875, men like Samuel Bell didn't admit to being wrong. Sarah felt sick. She thought of the woman's terrified face, her bloodied hands pressed against the glass. 30 years in an attic, 30 years of captivity while the world moved on outside, while the family that held her prisoner sat down to meals and celebrated holidays and had their photograph taken. "What happened to them?" she whispered. "Where did they go?" James stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening yard. "That's what I need you to understand. That's why I had to have the photograph restored. There's something about that image, something that's been passed down through my family. When Catherine sent that letter, she included a description of the photograph. But her description doesn't match what you see now. She described 5 people in front of the house. Just 5. No face in the window." Sarah's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. Photographs don't change." "Don't they?" James turned back to her, and in the fading light his face looked gaunt and afraid. Or maybe they reveal what was always there, what was hidden. Anna Whitmore died in that attic. She died before the family disappeared, maybe days before, maybe hours. Catherine knew. She tried to help Anna escape, but she was too late. And when Samuel realized what Catherine had attempted, he knew she would talk. He knew the truth would come out, so he made a choice. He killed his entire family and then himself. The bodies are somewhere on this property, buried deep where they would never be found. And Anna's ghost, her presence, her rage at being forgotten, somehow imprinted itself on that photograph. She made herself visible. She made sure that someone, someday, would see her, would know what was done to her. The room was almost completely dark now. Sarah could barely see James's face across from her. "You said you wanted to know the truth before you sold the estate. Why?" "Because I can't live here anymore," James said, and his voice cracked with emotion. "Because every night I hear footsteps in the attic. I hear chains dragging across the floor. I hear a woman sobbing. I thought if I understood what happened, if I could prove the truth, maybe it would stop. Maybe she could finally rest. But I'm afraid now. I'm afraid that by restoring the photograph, by making her face clear, we've done something we can't undo. I'm afraid we've given her power." Sarah wanted to dismiss his words as superstition, as the ramblings of a lonely old man living in a house full of ghosts and guilt. But she couldn't. She had felt something when she restored that photograph, something that had followed her from her studio. And sitting here, in this house where such terrible things had happened, she could feel it even more strongly. A presence, waiting, watching. "Show me the attic," she said. James shook his head vehemently. "No, I haven't been up there in years. I won't go up there." "Then give me a flashlight and tell me how to find it." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He retrieved a flashlight from a drawer and led her to a narrow staircase at the back of the house. "Up these stairs, turn right, and you'll find a smaller staircase leading to the attic. The door is locked, but the key is on a nail beside the frame. Miss Mitchell, please be careful. Whatever is up there, it's been waiting a long time." Sarah climbed the stairs, her footsteps creaking on the old wood. The house seemed to close in around her as she ascended, the air growing colder with each step. She found the attic door exactly where James had described, a heavy oak panel with a modern padlock that seemed out of place. The key hung on a nail that had been driven into the doorframe decades ago, rusted and permanent. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door. It swung open with a groan, revealing a darkness that the flashlight barely penetrated. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a long, low-ceilinged room that ran the length of the house. The floor was covered in dust and debris, but Sarah could see the remnants of what James had described. In one corner, bolts protruded from the floorboards, where chains had once been attached. The walls were covered in scratches, some forming patterns that might have been words, desperate messages carved into the wood with broken fingernails. Sarah moved deeper into the attic, her flashlight sweeping across the space. There, in the center of the room, she found something that made her stop breathing. A window. Its glass cracked and filthy, looked out over the front of the property. This was the window. This was where Anna Whitmore had pressed her bloodied hands against the glass while the Bell family posed for their photograph below. This was the window through which she had watched the world she could never be part of. Sarah approached the window and looked out. Even in the darkness, she could see the spot where the photographer would have set up his equipment, where the family would have stood. She imagined Anna standing here, seeing the preparation, understanding that this moment would be preserved, that the Bells would be remembered while she was forgotten. Had she tried to be seen? Had she deliberately placed herself where the camera might catch her? A sound behind her made Sarah spin around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a moment she saw nothing. Then, in the far corner, something moved. A shape, darker than the shadows around it, shifting and coalescing. Sarah's rational mind told her it was just her imagination, just fear, making her see things that weren't there. But another part of her, a deeper part, knew better. "Anna!" she whispered into the darkness. The temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath came out in thick clouds. The shape in the corner solidified, taking on the vague form of a woman. Sarah couldn't see details, couldn't make out a face, but she could feel the rage and sorrow emanating from it like heat from a fire. The flashlight flickered, the beam guttering like a candle in wind. "I know what happened to you," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know you were kept here, that you died here. I know you've been forgotten, but I see you now. The photograph shows you, your face, your suffering. It's documented. It's proof. People will know." The shape moved closer, and Sarah fought the urge to run. She stood her ground, even as every instinct screamed at her to flee. "You deserve to be remembered," she continued, "not as a ghost story, not as a legend, but as a person. Anna Whitmore. I'll make sure people know your name, know what was done to you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the shape began to fade. The temperature rose slightly. The flashlight steadied. Sarah felt the presence withdraw, not disappearing entirely, but pulling back, waiting. She understood then what James had meant about giving her power. By restoring the photograph, by making Anna visible, they had given her something she had been denied in life: a voice, a presence, a way to be remembered. Sarah left the attic, locking the door behind her with hands that still shook. She descended the stairs to find James waiting in the parlor, his face pale and anxious. "Did you see her?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "And I understand now. She's not haunting this house because she wants revenge. She's haunting it because she wants to be acknowledged. She spent 30 years invisible, and she won't let herself be invisible anymore." She gathered her materials, preparing to leave. "Mr. Carmichael, I'm going to write about this. I'm going to research Anna Whitmore's life, find records of her arrival in America, document everything that happened to her. The photograph will be part of that documentation. Her face, captured in that window, will be seen by people who study history, who care about the stories of those who were silenced. Is that acceptable to you?" James nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, that's what Catherine would have wanted. That's what Anna deserves." Sarah drove back to Nashville in the dark, her mind full of what she had learned, what she had experienced. The photograph sat beside her, and she no longer feared it. She understood it now. It was evidence, testimony from beyond the grave. Anna Whitmore had found a way to make herself seen, to ensure that the truth about her captivity and death would not die with the Bell family. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into research. She found immigration records showing Anna Whitmore's arrival in New York in 1842, a 16-year-old girl from County Cork, Ireland, fleeing the potato famine. She found the record of her indentured servitude contract sold to a broker in Tennessee. She found the bill of sale transferring that contract to Samuel Bell in 1845. After that, the records went silent. No marriage record, no death certificate, no indication that Anna Whitmore had ever existed beyond that point. But Sarah also found Catherine Bell's letter to her cousin in Memphis, preserved in a family collection that had been donated to the Tennessee State Library. In it, Catherine described Anna's imprisonment in heartbreaking detail. She wrote about Anna's repeated attempts to escape, about Samuel's increasingly violent punishments, about the family's silent complicity. She wrote about how Anna's spirit had been broken over the years, how she had stopped speaking, stopped eating, stopped hoping, and she wrote about Anna's death 3 days before the photograph was taken, her body left in the attic while the family debated what to do. Sarah compiled everything into a comprehensive article, which she submitted to a historical journal specializing in American social history. The article was titled, "Anna Whitmore and the Hidden History of Indentured Servitude in Post-Civil War Tennessee." The restored photograph accompanied it, with Anna's face in the window clearly visible, undeniable evidence of her presence and her suffering. The article was published and created a minor sensation among historians. It sparked discussions about the treatment of indentured servants, about the ways in which labor exploitation continued even after slavery was abolished, about the silencing of voices deemed unimportant or inconvenient. Anna Whitmore's name entered the historical record. She was remembered. 3 months after the article's publication, Sarah received a call from James Carmichael. His voice was stronger than when she had first met him, steadier. "It's stopped," he said without preamble. "The noises, the presence, all of it. The house is quiet for the first time in years. I think she's at peace now. I think knowing that people see her, that her story is told, it's given her rest." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm glad," she said. "She deserved that peace a long time ago." "There's something else," James continued. "I had a surveyor come to examine the property before I sell. They found something. There's a depression in the ground, about 50 yards behind the house, near the old slave quarters. The surveyor thinks it might be an old root cellar or cistern, but it's in the wrong place for either of those. I think it might be where Samuel buried them." Sarah's breath caught. "Have you contacted the authorities?" "I did. They're sending a forensic team next week. If it is the Bell family grave, at least they'll have proper burials. At least that chapter can be closed." He paused. "Thank you, Ms. Mitchell, for everything. For giving Anna a voice, for helping us all find some peace." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her studio, looking at the copy of the restored photograph hanging on her wall. She had kept one print for herself, a reminder of what she had learned. Photography wasn't just about preserving beauty or documenting happy moments. Sometimes it preserved truth, even uncomfortable truth, even terrible truth. It gave voices to those who had been silenced, made visible those who had been hidden. The forensic team did find remains in the depression behind the Bell house. 5 bodies, buried in a crude grave. DNA analysis would take time, but the location and circumstances left little doubt about their identity. The discovery made national news. One of the oldest cold cases in Tennessee history finally solved. But Sarah noticed that most news reports focused on the Bell family, on their disappearance and death. Anna Whitmore was mentioned only in passing, if at all. She did more interviews, made sure that every journalist who contacted her heard Anna's story in full. She spoke at historical conferences, wrote follow-up articles, created a website dedicated to documenting cases of indentured servitude abuse. Anna's face, captured in that window in 1875, became a symbol, a reminder that history is full of invisible people, those whose suffering went unrecorded, whose voices were silenced by those with power. One evening, Sarah received an email from a woman in Ireland. She had seen Sarah's article and had done her own research. She believed she was a descendant of Anna Whitmore's sister, who had remained in Ireland when Anna emigrated. The woman thanked Sarah for giving her ancestor a name, a story, a place in history. She included a photograph of Anna's grave marker in County Cork, Ireland, a stone placed there by the family a year after Anna's departure, when they gave up hope of hearing from her again. It bore a simple inscription, Anna Whitmore, 1826. Gone, but not forgotten. Sarah stared at that photograph for a long time, thinking about the bitter irony, a grave marker placed for a girl who had no grave, who would die thousands of miles away in an attic prison. But also thinking about the power of remembrance, about the human need to be seen and acknowledged even after death. She replied to the email, offering to visit Ireland and meet Anna's descendants. She wanted to tell them everything, wanted to share the details that hadn't made it into the article. They deserved to know their ancestors' full story, no matter how painful. They deserved to see the photograph, to see Anna's face looking out from that window, refusing to be forgotten. As she typed her response, Sarah glanced at the photograph on her wall. In the fading evening light, for just a moment, Anna's face seemed different. The terror and rage were still there, but beneath them, Sarah thought she saw something else. Relief, gratitude, peace. She blinked, and the impression was gone. It was just a photograph again, just a moment captured in silver and time. But Sarah knew better now. Photographs were never just images. They were witnesses. They were evidence. They were voices for those who could no longer speak. And sometimes, if you looked closely enough, they showed you truths that the people who commissioned them never intended to reveal. The Bell family photograph had changed after its restoration. But perhaps it hadn't changed at all. Perhaps Anna had always been there, waiting patiently for someone to look closely enough, to care enough, to see her. For nearly 150 years, she had been visible to anyone willing to see, a silent testimony to the injustice done to her. And now, finally, she was not just visible, but acknowledged. Her story was told. Her name was remembered. In her studio that night, Sarah began planning her trip to Ireland. She would take the photograph with her, show it to Anna's descendants, connect them to this piece of their history. It seemed important somehow to bring Anna's image home, even if only symbolically. It seemed like the least she could do. As she worked, organizing travel documents and making hotel reservations, Sarah heard a sound that made her pause. It was soft, barely audible, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, but there was no wind, and she had no chimes. The sound came from the photograph on the wall. She approached it slowly, listening. It faded as she drew near, but for just a moment she could have sworn she heard something else beneath it. A whisper, a sigh, a single word that might have been, "Thank you." Sarah smiled, touching the frame gently. "You're welcome, Anna," she said to the empty room. "Rest now. You've been seen." And the following months passed in a blur of activity. Sarah travelled to Ireland, met with Anna's descendants, shared the photograph and the story behind it. She gave lectures at universities about the intersection of photography and historical justice. She consulted on other cold cases where old photographs might hold clues. Her work took on new meaning, new purpose. She wasn't just restoring damaged images anymore. She was restoring lost voices, forgotten lives. The Bell House in Red Boiling Springs was eventually sold. James Carmichael moved to a retirement community in Nashville, closer to his remaining family. The new owners of the property turned it into a small museum, documenting the history of indentured servitude in Tennessee. Anna Whitmore's story was prominently featured, with the restored photograph as the centerpiece. Visitors came from across the country to see the house where such terrible things had happened, to learn about a chapter of American history that textbooks rarely covered. On the anniversary of Anna's documented death date, the museum held a memorial service. Sarah attended, along with several of Anna's Irish relatives who had made the journey. They placed flowers on the spot where Anna's remains had been found, now marked with a proper headstone that James Carmichael had commissioned. It read, Anna Whitmore, 1826-1875, silenced in life, remembered in death. As Sarah stood there, surrounded by people who had come to honor a woman they had never known, she felt a sense of completion. This was what justice looked like when it came too late to save someone, when all you could offer was remembrance and acknowledgement. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. It was a refusal to let cruelty and suffering remain hidden. It was a declaration that every life matters, that every voice deserves to be heard, even if it takes 150 years. The sun set over the Tennessee hills, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Sarah looked back at the house one last time, at the window where Anna had stood all those years ago. The glass had been replaced, cleaned, modernized. There was no face in it now, no bloodied hands pressed against the pane. The house was just a house, the window just a window. Whatever presence had lingered there was gone now, satisfied that the truth had been told. Sarah returned to her studio in Nashville with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there were other photographs out there, other images hiding stories that needed to be told. She had developed a reputation now, and people sent her their family photographs, their estate sale finds, their mysterious images that held secrets. She examined each one with careful attention, looking for what wasn't immediately visible, listening for the voices that wanted to speak. Not all of them held stories as dramatic as Anna's. Most were simpler, smaller, but no less important to the families involved. A soldier who had been erased from a family photograph after coming home with what they called shell shock and was institutionalized. A mixed-race child who appeared in the corner of a 1920s photograph, evidence of family secrets that had been whispered about but never confirmed. An immigrant woman whose face had been deliberately scratched out after she died of tuberculosis, as if erasing her image could erase the shame of her illness. Each photograph Sarah restored was an act of bearing witness. She made the invisible visible. She brought the forgotten into focus, and in doing so, she found her own calling, her own way of making the world a little more just, a little more honest. It wasn't the kind of justice that courts dealt out, but it was real nonetheless. It was the justice of truth, of acknowledgement, of refusing to let the powerful erase those they had harmed. Years later, Sarah would give a TED talk about her work. She would show the Bell family photograph, now famous in certain circles, and talk about what it taught her. "We live in an age where we take thousands of photographs," she would say. "We document every moment of our lives and share them instantly with the world. But we've lost something that the Victorians understood. They knew that photographs were witnesses. They knew that cameras captured more than we intended, that they preserved truths we might prefer to hide." Anna Whitmore understood this too. When that photographer set up his camera in front of the Bell House in 1875, she made a choice. She positioned herself in that window, knowing that the exposure time was long enough, hoping that the camera might see what the people around her refused to acknowledge. She used the technology of her time to speak from beyond her imprisonment and eventually beyond her death. The talk would be viewed millions of times online. Sarah would receive emails from people around the world, telling her their own stories of family secrets revealed through old photographs, of ancestors whose existence had been hidden or denied. The conversation about historical justice, about whose stories get told and whose get erased, would continue and grow. But the image that stayed with people, the one that was shared and discussed and debated, was always the Bell family photograph. Anna's face in the window, her terror and rage and desperate need to be seen, became a symbol for all the silenced voices in history, all the people who had been made invisible by those with power over them. Sarah never tired of talking about the photograph, never grew weary of telling Anna's story. Each time she shared it, she felt like she was honoring a promise she had made in that attic to ensure that Anna Whitmore would be remembered not as a ghost story, but as a person. A woman who had suffered terribly and yet had found a way to make her voice heard across the gulf of death and time. The photograph hung in museums, was reproduced in textbooks, became part of the permanent collection at the Library of Congress. Scholars analyzed it, artists created works inspired by it. Teachers used it to spark conversations about power and freedom and the importance of bearing witness to injustice. Anna's face, captured in that window in 1875, achieved a kind of immortality. She had wanted to be seen, and now millions of people saw her. She had wanted to be remembered, and now her name was known around the world. Sometimes, late at night in her studio, Sarah would look at her personal copy of the photograph and wonder if Anna knew. If somehow, wherever she was, she understood that her desperate act of positioning herself in that window had worked, that the camera had seen her, that her testimony had been preserved, that justice, however delayed, however incomplete, had finally been served. Sarah liked to think that Anna did know that in whatever form consciousness took after death, she had found peace. The Bell family photograph had indeed changed after restoration, but not in the way that ghost stories suggested. It hadn't transformed from one image to another. Instead, what had always been there had simply been made clear. Anna had always been in that window. Her face had always been pressed against the glass. Her bloodied hands had always been visible. It had just taken the right person at the right time, with the right tools and the right willingness to see, to bring her into focus, to make her undeniable, to let her speak. And in speaking, Anna Whitmore had delivered a message that echoed across the centuries. A message about the fundamental human right to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be free. A message about the responsibility of those with power to use it justly. A message about the importance of bearing witness, of documenting truth, of refusing to let suffering remain hidden. It was a message written in silver and light, preserved on a metal plate, waiting patiently for someone to hear it. Sarah had heard it, and she had made sure that the world heard it too. That was her gift to Anna, and in a strange way, Anna's gift to her. The photograph had changed Sarah's life, had given her purpose and direction. It had taught her that every image holds stories, that every face in every photograph is a person who lived and loved and suffered and deserved to be remembered. It had taught her that justice isn't always immediate, isn't always complete, but is always worth pursuing. And it had taught her that sometimes the dead do speak to us if we're willing to listen. The horrifying revelation of the Bell family photo that changed after restoration wasn't really about supernatural transformation. It was about human cruelty and human courage. It was about a woman who refused to be forgotten and a family that paid the ultimate price for their sins. It was about the power of truth to surface, even when buried deep. And it was about freedom, the most fundamental of human needs, and what happens when it's denied. Anna Whitmore had been robbed of her freedom in life, but in death, she had found a way to free herself from obscurity, from silence, from the grave of history, where victims are so often buried alongside their abusers. Her face in that window was a declaration of existence. I was here. I suffered. I matter. See me. Remember me. Let my story be told. And now it had been. Sarah had made sure of that. It was her life's work now, ensuring that photographs like Anna's continued to speak, that the voices captured in silver and glass and paper continued to be heard. Because if history had taught her anything, it was that there were always more Annas, always more people whose stories had been suppressed, whose faces had been turned away from the camera, whose voices had been silenced. But photographs remembered. They preserved. They testified, and with enough care, enough skill, and enough compassion, they could be made to speak again. That was the true revelation of the Bell family photograph. Not that it had changed, but that it had always held the truth, waiting for someone to see it, waiting for someone to care enough to make Anna Whitmore visible again, to give her back her name, her story, her freedom to be remembered. In the end, that was the only freedom Anna could have, the freedom that comes from being witnessed, being acknowledged, being part of the historical record. It wasn't the freedom she deserved in life, but it was the freedom she could claim in death, and Sarah had helped her claim it, restored not just her image but her humanity, her place in the story of America's long struggle with questions of power and captivity and the fundamental rights of every person to live free from chains, whether those chains were made of metal or silence. The photograph hung on Sarah's wall, a reminder and a responsibility. Every time she looked at it, she saw Anna looking back, and she heard that whispered thank you. It drove her forward, kept her searching, kept her listening for other voices that needed to be heard. Because Anna Whitmore's story wasn't unique. It was just one of millions, most of which would never be known, would never be documented, would never see justice of any kind. But Sarah could help some of them. She could restore their images, research their stories, make sure they weren't forgotten. It was the least she could do. It was everything she could do. And she would keep doing it for as long as she lived, for as long as there were old photographs waiting to reveal their secrets, for as long as there were voices from the past calling out to be heard. The horrifying revelation of the Bell family photo that changed after restoration was complete. But the work of bearing witness, of pursuing historical justice, of making the invisible visible, would never be finished. There would always be more photographs to restore, more stories to uncover, more truths to tell. Sarah understood that now, and she embraced it. This mission that Anna had given her, this responsibility to be a voice for the voiceless, eyes for those who had been deliberately unseen. It was her calling, her purpose, her way of making meaning from the tragedy of the past, and ensuring that such tragedies, such injustices, would at least be remembered, acknowledged, mourned, that the Anna Whitmores of history would not disappear without trace, but would leave behind evidence of their existence, their suffering, and their refusal to be forgotten. The photograph was that evidence, and Sarah was its interpreter, its guardian, its witness. Together they told a story that needed telling, a story of horror and hope, of cruelty and courage, of death and a strange kind of resurrection. A story that would live on long after Sarah herself was gone, preserved in archives and museums, told and retold, reminding each new generation that freedom is never guaranteed, that power can corrupt absolutely, and that the dead sometimes speak to us through the images they leave behind, if only we have the wisdom and compassion